العظيم وبعد. So inshallah bi'idhnillah, continuing with the Ihya of Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala wa radiya an. And we came last week to the fifth section of this current chapter, which is looking at knowledge, Kitab al-Ilm. So he says rahimahullah ta'ala, al-Bab al-Khamis fi adab al-Muta'allimi wal-Mu'allim, the etiquettes of the seeker and the one who is teaching. The Muta'allim being the learner and the Mu'allim being the teacher. And as we spoke about last week in slight detail, not too much detail to be honest, but etiquettes of seeking knowledge for us as Muslims, as believers, it's a culture, number one, and it's a science, number two. We have books that have been authored in this science. And some of the earlier scholars of Islam, they would learn the akhlaq, the adab from their teachers prior to the knowledge. Imam Malik, his mother, rahimahullah ta'ala, she said to Imam Malik prior to sending him off to his first teacher, learn from his akhlaq before you learn from his ilm. And this is something which we've lost today. We've lost that heritage where we learn from character, we learn from a person's interaction, their speech, their mannerisms, the way they eat, the way they drink, and so on and so forth. This was something that was carried out in the earlier years of Islam. And Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he suggests that this was lost even in his time. But the point is anyway, we'll try to finish this section today bi'idhnillah, at least the muta'allim. So the muta'allim is the learner. And we took some of these last week, but we'll just recap on them. He says, أَمَّا الْمُتَعَلِّمْ فَآدَابُهُ وَوَظَائِفُهُ وَالظَّاهِرَةِ كَثِيرًا. So the etiquettes and the goals that the seeker of knowledge, and when he says the seeker of knowledge, he means the seeker of the sacred sciences, religious knowledge. They should have certain etiquettes about them. If a person becomes a learner of Islam, a seeker of that which is sacred, i.e. the framework of Islam, then they should be known by their character before their speech. A person should see someone who's learned and say, this person, there's something about him, there's something about her. What is it? And of course we know it's the knowledge that they're learning. It's not befitting for a person who's learning the science of Islam, the sciences of Islam, a person who's memorizing the Quran, a person who's learning the Arabic language, a person who's studying fiqh or hadith. It's not befitting for that person to be foul-mouthed, for example, to swear, to be rude, to be abusive, to not be able to control their anger, to be seen talking about that which is not befitting of a person who's fulfilling such a noble role within this life, which is to preserve the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately. So he says, number one, al-wadhifatul ula taqdeemu taharat al-nafsi an radha'il al-akhlaqi wa madhmum al-awsaf. So we spoke about this last week, that a person basically makes their primary goal in seeking knowledge, what? Purification of their inner self from that which is considered to be negative character traits and that which is considered to be from bad character generally speaking, to rid the heart of its sicknesses and to rid the character of its ills. That's the first and primary goal of a person who's seeking knowledge, to purify their heart and to rectify their character. The Prophet ﷺ, what did he say? I came to complete good character. And when we really think about it, Islam is character. Character with Allah and character with Allah's creation. خُلُقٌ مَعَ الْخَالِقِ وَخُلُقٌ مَعَ الْخَلْقِ. To have good character with Allah and good character with His creation. If you know how to have good character with Allah and you know how to have good character with His creation, then you are upon al-istiqamah, the right path. The question is, how do I have good character with Allah? How do I have good character with the creation? And a person who thinks in such a manner will achieve those goals. Why? Because when they're learning, when they're studying with those purposes in mind. So he says, for example, العلم عبادة القلب وصلاة السر وقربة الباطن وكما لا تصح الصلاة التي هي وظيفة الجوارح الظاهرة إلا بتطهير الظاهر عن الأحداث والأخباث فكذلك لا تصح عبادة الباطن وعمارة القلب بالعلم إلا بعد طهارته عن خبائث الأخلاق. So as we said last week, he mentions, just as your prayer is not valid unless you purify your body prior to praying, likewise your ilm and the worship of your heart is not valid unless you first purify the vessel within which the knowledge is going to be poured. If you pour water into a dirtied cup, what happens? Does the water purify the dirt, or the water becomes dirtied? The water usually becomes dirtied. Likewise, if you pour knowledge into your heart and you don't clean your heart, what's going to happen to the knowledge? The knowledge is going to be dirtied. What does that mean? The person, rather than using the knowledge as a vehicle to arrive at Allah, the person uses the knowledge as a vehicle to arrive at what? At the self, desire, fame, money, so on and so forth. A person, rather than understanding what the knowledge is actually implying, they understand what they can perceive due to the dirt on their heart. Their vision is not clear. And so it's important to work on purification of the heart, purification of intention, ridding our hearts of enmity, and so on and so forth. And this book, we go through that inshallah once we get there bi'idhnillah. Then he says, الوظيفة الثانية أن يقلل علاقته من الاشتغال بالدنيا فإن العلائق شاغلة وصارفة قال الله تعالى ما جعل الله لرجل من قلبين في جوفه. As we mentioned last week, and we had a discussion about this, to cut ties with this place. This place will keep you from where you're going. The firmer your roots are in the soil that we call earth, the more difficult it becomes to traverse the path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the akhirah. That's a reality. That's why you find the young are willing to sacrifice. Victory is built upon the backs of the young. Why? Because the young have not yet firmly planted their roots into the ground. The older a man gets, the more roots he grows. I've got responsibilities, I've got a wife, I've got kids, I've got a house, I've got this, I've got that, and so on and so forth. But for a young man, they don't have all of that. And so they're willing to sacrifice. They can easily give up things because they haven't really tasted those things for very long. But for us, we acquire the taste that is this dunya. And so a person who's conscious of that fact, what does he do? He tries to keep his interactions with this dunya, his connections to this dunya as limited as possible. Through training the self, conditioning the self. And we live in a society. Is it based upon cutting ties with this dunya? No. It's based upon what? Acquiring as much as this dunya as you possibly can. And we justify it. We live in a society that's sick, so what's going to happen to us? We're going to become sick. If you're in a room with a sick person, you will become sick. And so we have to realize the sickness and realize the sickness in us. Love of this life. This society is built upon love of this life. This whole philosophy is built upon what? Acquirement of this world. Our philosophy is one of shunning this world and preparing for the next. And the two are at a clash with each other. It's not to say that you can't enjoy from this life, but this life shouldn't be the purpose. This life is a means of attaining what? The next life. When this life becomes a purpose in and of itself, there's a problem. When food is no longer eaten because of the function, but rather because of the pleasure, you become obese. When you are intimate, no longer because of the function, but rather simply because of the pleasure, you have the society that we have today, which is a promiscuous society. When the desire becomes a driving force, we start to become individualistic and so on and so forth. Food can be enjoyed, but food should be eaten for a purpose. Being intimate with one's spouse can be enjoyed, but if it's for a purpose, and so on and so forth. We are a purpose-driven people. Believers, we are a purpose-driven people. What we do should have a purpose. If there is no purpose behind it, then it's a waste of time. Even when we're just simply resting. For example, if a person decides, I want to play some sports, it may be even playing a computer game, whatever the case. If they're doing that for the sake of revitalizing themselves, so that they can continue in worshipping Allah, sacrificing for Allah, doing that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to do, then there's a purpose to it. But if I'm only doing it for the sake of enjoyment and pleasure, what's going to happen? I'm going to need more and more of it. Why? Because the more of something that you have, the more desensitized you become to it, and the more of it you need to receive the same stimulation that you initially received. And so you seek more of it. You seek more of it. A person who's filled with one meal becomes, hungry for more, except for the one who's conscious of that fact, and they learn to say no, they learn to abstain. And for us it's important, learning about the self, and we had a long discussion about it, not long but a reasonably lengthy discussion about it last week. And he says, look, وَمَهْمَا تَوَزَّعَتِ الْفِكْرَةُ قَصُرَتْ عَنْ دَرْكِ الْحَقَائِقِ وَالْفِكْرَةُ الْمُتَوَزِّعَةُ عَلَى أُمُورِ مُتَفَرِّقَةٍ كَجَدْوَلٍ تَفَرَّقَ مَاؤُهُ فَنَشِفَتِ الْأَرْضُ بَعْضُ وَاخْتَطَفَ الْهَوَاءُ بَعْضُهُ فَلَا يَبْقَى مِنْهُ مَا يَجْتَمِعُ وَيَبْلُغُ الْمَزْرُوعُ. The person whose thoughts are scattered, the person whose heart is scattered, does not have the energy which is required in order to focus on one thing properly. When I'm trying to read a book, if my mind is thinking about WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and this video and that video and so on and so forth, how am I supposed to read? If I have something and I'm waiting for a notification, how am I supposed to read? And likewise with everything else. The more focused we become on the akhirah, the less focused we'll be on this dunya. The more focused we become on this dunya, the less focused we'll be on this akhirah. To strike a balance is difficult, but that's what we have to try to achieve. How do we strike a balance? By making this dunya a means of serving our akhirah. We don't acquire the dunya for itself, we acquire the dunya for the function it provides in serving our akhirah. If that's our approach, then we'll strike that balance. And then he says, الوظيفة الثانية أن لا يتكبر على العلم ولا يتأمر على معلم بل يلقي إليه زمام أمره ويذعن لنصيحته إذعان المريض الجاهل للطبيب الحاذق. That the person does not become arrogant, does not belittle anything of knowledge. He doesn't look at something and say, I've already studied this, I don't need to revise this, I don't need to know this, I want something bigger. I don't just want to learn the basics of fiqh, I want to know the differences of opinion. I want to know the deepness of fiqh and so on and so forth. No, the person who is sincere and really wants to learn, they start with the basics. Because they know that if you don't have the basics, you can't move up. You might understand certain things, but there's going to be gaps in your understanding. Why? Because you have gaps in your foundation. If you build a house over a foundation which is not equal, what's going to happen? You're going to take a step one day and you're going to fall through. Because you didn't place the foundation properly, you didn't level it out. And so you can fall through in certain parts of the house. Likewise with knowledge, you have to even out the foundation, build it properly. Make sure you understand the basics before moving on to the second floor. Otherwise, your house will fall on top of you. And that's what many people today do. They're hasty, they want to know the intimate subjects, they want to know the hot topics of the day, and they don't take the time, they're not patient enough to learn and build themselves up. He says if you really want to benefit, you need to present the rein of your affair, i.e. like the reins that a rider uses to direct his horse. You need to present those reins to your teacher and let him direct you accordingly. And no person learns without at first being a blind follower. If you're not at first a blind follower, you're not going to learn. Inquisitiveness is positive. Critical thinking is positive. But you can't critically think about something if you don't have the tools to analyze. So first you need to blind follow and learn those tools. You need to learn how to use the hammer before you try to hammer something. Otherwise you'll hurt yourself and you'll hurt others. Likewise in knowledge, it's the same thing. And if a person thinks, I know more than what this teacher is teaching me, i.e. I don't need to know these basic things, they should ask themselves, perhaps there's arrogance in my heart. Perhaps I'm too hasty because of a sickness in my heart. He says, فَلَا يَنَالُ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا بِالتَّوَاضُعِ وَإِلْقَاءِ السَّمْعِ. And he says that knowledge is not acquired except with what? Humility and giving the teacher full ear, full heart, full conviction in learning from the teacher that which the teacher is presenting. And of course he's talking about an age where there were great ulama and teachers, etc. Today, unfortunately, it's not necessarily the case. We do have amazing teachers, alhamdulillah, but they're very far and few for those who are blessed to learn from them. Therefore, we try to take anything that we can get, and we focus on the classical text, the classical understanding of Islam, with an eye to contextualize and implement according to our times, which is something which is acquired over time. It's not immediate. He says, ومعنى كونه, that we went into that last week, we don't need to go into it too much. He says الوظيفة الرابعة أن يحترز الخائض في العلم في مبدأ الأمر عن الإصغاء إلى اختلاف الناس سواء كان ما خاض فيه من علوم الدنيا أو من علوم الآخرة فإن ذلك يدهش عقله ويحير ذهنه ويفتر رأيه بل ينبغي أن يتقن الطريق الواحد المرضية عند أستاذه ثم بعد ذلك يصغي إلى المذاهب. So he says that a person initially should ignore the differences of opinion amongst the people. Ignore the differences of opinion. Ignore the differences of approaches. Ignore the various views that a person may hear. Ignore the Twitter debates and the YouTube discussions and the Facebook posts and the WhatsApp chit-chat, he said, she said, and just focus on acquiring understanding of traditional Islam according to one school of thought. Don't waste time. Why? Because it will become confusing. And he says this is regardless whether it's knowledge that relates to the dunya or knowledge that relates to the akhirah. He says this is in all types of knowledge. And in particular, of course, Islamic knowledge. If I master a particular school, one madhab, then I can move on to the differences of opinion. Are you okay, brother?
Yeah.
Huh? Do you need help? Then he can move on to the differences of opinion. Everything okay? So then he can move on to the differences of opinion. He says الوظيفة الخامسة ألا يخوض في فن من فنون العلم دفعة. That a person doesn't try to acquire everything all at one time. He doesn't say, I want to study language, fiqh, usul al-fiqh, aqidah, hadith, tafsir, and so on and so forth. No, he takes it one step at a time, one science at a time. He learns things bit by bit. He starts with the alphabet, then he starts with the tajweed, then he moves on to proper qira'ah, and so on and so forth. Likewise in fiqh, he starts with the basics, then he moves on. If you try to acquire everything all at one time, what's going to happen? It's going to become confusing. We might read about Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah. He used to study, he had 12 different lessons a day. That was at a later stage. Though that was with an individual who used to study at a very young age and built his way up. If a person tries to attend 12 different lessons in one day today, they're going to go home and they're going to burn out within a week or two. It's about taking a science by itself, understanding it, moving on to the next science, starting with the basics, being patient, understanding that if a person wants to learn and wants to be a person of real understanding, it's going to take time. It's going to take years. It's not going to happen in a month or 2 months or 3 months. It's not going to happen in a year or 2 years or 3 years. It's a lifetime of dedication. Can a person acquire understanding of Islam in a few years? Definitely. But it's not going to be like the understanding of the ulama. Can a person acquire an understanding of Islam in a week or 2 weeks? Perhaps, but a very basic understanding of something simple from Islam. If a person wants to learn, they have to dedicate themselves to learning. Just like medicine, just like science, just like any of the other different areas that are studied today. If you go to university, you're willing to study for 4 years, 3 years, 6 or 7 years for some areas in order to acquire the qualification that's necessary for you to continue your journey. Likewise, if a person wants to become a person who understands Islam properly, they have to accept the fact that it's going to take years. And if you have that mindset, you'll slow down a little bit. You won't be hasty, you won't rush. Why? Because you know that you have years ahead of you. Then he says, الوظيفة السادسة ألا يخوض في فن حتى يستوفي الفن الذي قبله. And this is very important, that a person doesn't jump into a science until they have acquired a proficient level of understanding in the science that precedes the new science. A person would not, for example, study usul al-fiqh until they have acquired a reasonable understanding of fiqh first. Even though usul al-fiqh is the underlying principles to fiqh, You cannot understand usul al-fiqh if you don't have the ability to conceptualize what you're studying. Otherwise it's abstract. If you don't have the ability to conceptualize, you won't understand what you're reading. In order to conceptualize, you need to have studied the issues that are dealt with in fiqh. Likewise, a person doesn't try to read in 3 or 4 modes of recitation and they haven't mastered one mode of recitation. It's about starting with one thing, mastering it, or at least acquiring a level of proficiency and moving on to the next. There are some that can study multiple things at one time. They have the ability to do so. But being realistic is important. The individuals that used to study before, and for some who are blessed to do so today, they have the opportunity to dedicate themselves entirely to studying and nothing else. If it's like that for a person, they can apply 3 hours to Quran, 3 hours to Arabic, 3 hours to fiqh. But for most, it has to be one science at a time, one subject at a time. And if a person takes their time, doesn't try to take shortcuts, and applies him or herself a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, they'll look back and be amazed at the progress that they've made. But if a person tries to take shortcuts, tries to study too much, all at one time, they're going to be stuck in the same place for years. And that's a mistake that many people make. Many people, they're stuck in the same place for years. Why? Because they do not focus on one particular thing at a time. They try to do too much. They rush and they burn out. Or they're stuck in the same place and after a few years they say to themselves, I'm never going to be able to master anything. This is not for me. It's not necessarily that it's not for them. The problem is their methodology of approach. Then he says, الوظيفة السابعة أن يعرف السبب الذي به يدرك أشرف العلوم وأن ذلك يراد به شيئان أحدهما شرف الثمرة والثاني وثاقة الدليل وقوته. And this is not too relevant to us right now, but he's basically just saying a person or a student at least should have the ability to understand what the best of sciences are. And the way to understand what the best of sciences are, he says, number one, to know basically the fruit that the science provides. How do you judge which tree is the best tree? By knowing the fruit that comes from the tree. Until the fruit comes from the tree, you can't determine how valuable the tree is. A fig tree is more valuable than an orange tree. But you can only tell that when the fruits grow. Or if you're skilled in distinguishing trees, then you can tell the fig tree from the orange tree. He says likewise in knowledge. If you want to determine which is the most valuable types of knowledge, you have to look at the fruit that the knowledge provides. For example, fiqh. What does it provide? What's the fruit that it provides? How to worship Allah. So it's valuable. Quran, what does it provide? How to read the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's valuable. How do you determine which is the best of the two, and so on and so forth? By thinking in such a manner. He says, and number two, by knowing the authenticity of the evidences for the particular science or field that you're looking at, and the strength of these evidences. And this perhaps is when you look at things on a larger scale, maybe even when you're going beyond just the Islamic sciences. And then he says, وَالْوَظِيفَةُ الثَّامِنَةِ أَنْ يَكُونَ قَصْدَ الْمُتَعَلِّمِ فِي الْحَالِ تَحْلِيَةُ بَاطِنِهِ وَتَجْمِيلُهُ بِالْفَضِيلَةِ. And this is very important. Similar to the first point, he says that the intention of the student currently in the moment and continually wherever he is in his journey should be what? To basically purify and adorn his inner self and to beautify it with virtues. And this is something which transcends Islamic knowledge. That previously, no matter what philosophy you would look at, no matter who the people were that you were looking at, i.e. the people of knowledge, whether they were Muslims, non-Muslims, you would find that knowledge used to be sought for its virtues. And to be a man of virtue was considered to be a great thing. Today, unfortunately, vice has become virtue and virtue has become vice. The one who has not had a premarital relationship in general society is looked down upon for being chaste. And the one who has been promiscuous or is promiscuous is praised for his promiscuity. The one who who engages in that which has been determined to be sin by all of the books of revelation is praised and celebrated. And the one who calls it a sin is looked down upon and is abused, and so on and so forth. And this is the state of society that we live in today. Virtue has become vice, and vice has become virtue. And knowledge today, generally speaking, is no longer sought for the virtue. Knowledge wasn't sought because it led to a career previously. Knowledge previously was sought because knowledge raises man. And that's why you would have poor people who were highly knowledgeable. Regardless, it wasn't about wealth. Now, there is a correlation between knowledge and money, knowledge and career. A person doesn't study something if it's not going to give him some sort of value financially once he's finished studying it. Who goes to university, for example, to study medicine because they have an interest in medicine? Very few people. Who goes to university to study biology, for example, because they have an interest in biology? Very few people, if any. Majority of the time, knowledge is sought out because of financial value that is attached to the knowledge. That wasn't the case previously. And we have to make sure that when we study, especially Islam, we're studying for what? To fill ourselves with virtue, to become people of virtue. And that's only the case if a person applies that which they study. If a person doesn't apply that which they study, then they become a hypocrite. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. Then he says, الوظيفة التاسعة أن يعلم نسبة العلوم إلى المقصد كما يؤثر الرفيع القريب على البعيد والمهم على غيره. So basically to know which knowledge is most appropriate, when it's most appropriate, and so on and so forth. And he says, ومعنى المهم ما يهمك ولا يهمك إلا شأنك في الدنيا والآخرة وإذا لم يمكنك الجمع بين ملاذ الدنيا ونعيم الآخرة فالأهم ما يبقى أبد الآباد وعند ذلك تصير الدنيا منزلة والبدن مركبة والأعمال سعيا إلى المقصد ولا مقصد إلا لقاء الله تعالى ففيه النعيم كله. And this is an amazing statement, although perhaps I butchered it grammatically speaking, but it's an amazing statement. He says, to know, firstly, the last point he says, that a person should know the importance of particular sciences in accordance to how relevant they are and their virtue and so on and so forth, and their importance. He says, and the meaning of important here is what is important to you. So what is important to me may not be important to someone else. And it doesn't mean importance, i.e. interesting. It doesn't mean this is important to me, i.e. it's interesting. No. He says, and the only thing which is important to you is your dunya and your akhirah. Without your dunya, you can't work for your akhirah, your health, your wealth, and so on and so forth. And he says, and if you cannot marry between the two, i.e. enjoyment of this world and enjoyment of the akhirah, if you can't join between the two, being able to enjoy this world and working for the enjoyment of the akhirah, he says, then the most important is that which is going to remain. And what's going to remain? Our akhirah. He says, and if that's the case, and of course it's the case, Imam al-Ghazali knows it's the case, he says, this place simply becomes a temporary place of residence. And our bodies become basically borrowed vehicles. And our actions are our means of traveling towards that which we want to acquire, i.e. the pleasures of the akhirah. And there is no greater importance or greater goal that should be reached other than the meeting of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in that is all pleasure. He's saying there's no pleasure like the pleasure of meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah is pleased with us. He says, therefore, put that first and make everything else secondary. And here, look, if we see this place here as a temporary abode, and we see our bodies as borrowed, how is that going to change our mindsets? How would that change our mindsets? Many become fixated on their bodies, fixated on that which is temporary, and they forget about that which is permanent. But if we were to look at our bodies as being borrowed, our bodies have been leased to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how would we change the way that we interact with our own bodies. Perhaps we would look after them a bit better, number one, and we wouldn't become so fixated upon them. Why? They're simply vehicles for our souls, and our souls are traveling to the next life. We wouldn't become arrogant, we wouldn't become prideful, and so on and so forth. Likewise, if we saw this place as a real temporary abode. When you're in temporary accommodation and something breaks, are you going to try and fix it? No. Why? Because you're moving anyway. You'll say it's for the landlord to fix. I'm not spending my money on that. You're going to spend your money on what? On your new permanent home that you're going to move to. That's the reality of this dunya. Does it mean that we shouldn't care if things in this dunya break? No, of course not. Allah has given us responsibility. But we're not going to spend money furnishing it. Why would you spend money furnishing? Imagine you have a temporary accommodation and you're furnishing it and you're going to move out. You're not going to be able to take any of your furniture with you. You're furnishing a property that doesn't belong to you, and you're not going to benefit from the furnishing in any way whatsoever. Rather than furnishing your new home. That's what we're doing in this life. When we spend our time, our effort on this life, i.e. acquiring this life for the sake of this life, we're furnishing a home that doesn't belong to us. If we were smart, we would be furnishing our next life. And we can utilize that which we have here in this life for the sake of the next life. He says, فَتَأَمَّلْ هَذَا وَاقْبِلْ النَّصِيحَةَ مَجَّانًا مِمَّنْ قَامَ عَلَيْهِ ذَلِكَ غَالِيًا وَلَمْ يَصِلْ إِلَيْهِ إِلَّا بَعْدَ جُهْدٍ جَهِيدٍ. So he says, take this advice. Take it from someone who arrived at understanding these points and these things after a lot of struggle and a lot of time. Take it for free, without any effort. Because he himself, he's saying, it took him a lot of effort to arrive at these points and acquire these points, whether through experience or through researching and searching through the books of the righteous of the past. And we'll end with that, inshallah, and we'll continue with وظائف المعلم. So next week, inshallah, we'll go through the etiquettes and the adab of the muallim, bi'idhnillah. And if there are any questions, then feel free, inshallah.